expertise and experience of our members. We will be publishing that brief in just a couple of weeks, and just wanted to explain that we, in the process of developing that, engaged with an even broader set of stakeholders and experts outside of our membership, including in particular policymakers and regulators, to ensure that we provide a concise and comprehensive resource that helps content regulation efforts not only uphold, but enhance human rights in the digital realm. Over the course of this summer, we held roundtables similar to this one with officials and stakeholders focused on the EU Digital Services Act, India's draft amendments to its intermediary guidelines, the government of Pakistan's proposed rules against online harm, and the United Kingdom's online harms white paper. The brief, as I said, will be published in just a couple of weeks, and we encourage you to sign up for our newsletter on our website or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or LinkedIn so that you can receive the brief as soon as it is published. That brief uses international human rights law as its primary lens. The norms and principles articulated in international human rights law provide a universal, time-tested, and robust framework that can help lawmakers find creative and appropriate ways to engage stakeholders, reconcile different interests, and mitigate unintended consequences. The policy brief explores and explains three key principles from international human rights law and examines their relevance for content regulation efforts. And I will just quickly outline those here. The first principle of legality establishes that restrictions on freedom of expression must be provided by public laws formulated with sufficient precision to enable an individual to regulate his or her conduct accordingly. In other words, laws must clearly define what is prohibited and, by reference, what is allowed. Legality also insists that such laws must provide sufficient guidance to those charged with their execution to enable them to ascertain what sorts of expression are properly restricted and what are not. This is critical to ensuring that enforcement is predictable, consistent, and non-discriminatory. And this is particularly important when laws rely on private bodies, like platforms, rather than democratically accountable regulators or independent judiciaries to adjudicate and enforce such restrictions. For instance, in some countries, new laws are being proposed that would give regulators, existing or new ones, broad authority to create and define new categories of prohibited content. As we point out in the brief, such a broad delegation of authority must be accompanied by meaningful transparency and oversight to ensure that regulators avoid creating ambiguity and do not exceed their mandate. Here we can also see the wisdom of ensuring accessible and effective remedy as a way to mitigate the impacts of any inaccurate enforcement due to lack of clarity in definitions. The legality principle is essential to mitigating the chilling effects of ambiguous regulations, which can contribute to self-censorship from individuals who fear the consequences that could follow from failing to properly enforce the law. Second, the principle of legitimacy holds that laws restricting expression can only be justified to achieve specific enumerated purposes, such as the respect for the rights or reputations of others, or the protection of national security, public order, public health, or morals. While international law gives states significant latitude to determine what sorts of activities justify restrictions, that discretion is not unlimited. International courts and authorities have made clear that the right to freedom of expression is broad in its scope, encompassing even expression that may be regarded as deeply offensive. The principle of legitimacy is also related to the by now well-established maxim set out in numerous consensus United Nations resolutions that the same rights that people have offline must also be protected online, in particular freedom of expression. The wisdom behind these calls for equal treatment and against discrimination based on medium rests in part on the recognition that such inconsistencies are likely to be exploited by regimes and actors who do not respect democratic norms. Several of the initiatives we review focus on categories that we review in the brief, focus on categories of content that are not unlawful, but have the potential to cause harm, so-called lawful but awful or lawful but harmful content. These raise serious questions about whether such approaches will unduly restrict speech that may be deeply offensive to some, but should nevertheless be protected under international law. Finally, the principle of necessity requires that states seeking to restrict expression must demonstrate in specific and individualized fashion the precise nature of the threat they are seeking to address, and establish a direct and immediate connection between the expression and that threat. Related to that is the principle of proportionality, which means that any restrictive law, as well as actions of administrative and judicial authorities applying the law, must be proportionate to the interests being protected. appropriate to achieve that protective function, and be the least intrusive instrument among those that might achieve that protective function. In the content regulation context, these principles should guide lawmakers to think carefully about which types of services at which layers in the technology stack are most appropriately positioned to address the specific concerns at issue. It is also the case, in our view, that broadly shifting legal liability for illegal content from authors to intermediaries is almost never the least restrictive way to address such content. To the extent such regulations establish notice and takedown mechanisms, they must ensure legal responsibility for non-compliance is predicated on clear notices about specific content that has been adjudicated to be illegal by an independent authority. Similarly, punitive sanctions, rigid timelines for content adjudication, and preemptive filtering requirements are also likely to run afoul of the necessity and proportionality principles, and as such, are likely to prove ineffective or counterproductive. Instead, to ensure efforts are appropriately and narrowly tailored and guard against unintended consequences, lawmakers should look to proven approaches based on concepts like transparency, due process, including concepts like notice and counter notice, as well as remedy. They should also consider the perspectives of, and where appropriate, provide explicit protections for specific actors such as journalists and other vulnerable groups. Finally, it is important to note that many content regulation efforts, while focused on expression, also create implications for privacy. Of particular concern are those initiatives that would require companies to proactively monitor, track, or trace content on their platforms, which can have implications for and potentially limit the anonymity of users and the encryption of services that can provide important security and privacy protections. In the policy brief, we go into much more detail on each of these points and speak more about the ways that different countries' efforts are either consistent or inconsistent with these principles. So we look forward to sharing that policy brief with you soon and hope that it will be useful to you. Now that we've finished that presentation about the policy brief, I want to quickly turn things over to Jean Alon, Facebook's Human Rights Public Policy Manager in Africa. Jean's work at Facebook focuses on monitoring digital rights trends and designing programs to strengthen the capacity of African civil society to be safe, secure, and effective in their use of social media to advance human rights. Jean is going to talk to us for a few minutes about Facebook's thoughts on content regulation. Over to you, Jean.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. Yes, so first of all, I want to introduce myself. Like Jason said, I am the Human Rights Public Policy Manager for Facebook in the Africa region. I'm based in Dakar, Senegal, and my background is really around human rights research and programming. And so for today's panel, rather than talking about some of the global models that have been used to define Facebook's approach to online content regulation, I'd like to just take you through some of the thinking that's captured in our white paper. So for many of you, as you'll remember, in May of 2019, our CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, made an announcement that the internet needed to be regulated. And he basically called on governments around the world to create rules for the internet to contribute to a management and a regulation of internet that would keep people safe and that would promote the best uses of the internet, right? Uses that help us have businesses, create economic opportunity, and also to organize social movements and to have access to free speech. And so about a year later, our content policy team published this white paper, which was titled Charting a Way Forward on Online Content Regulation. And I want to take you through that paper today to give you some of the insights and the types of approaches that we find could be the most useful for content regulation. So I'm going to share my screen and then I'll go through the presentation. Okay, I don't think it's working, so I will just talk through it so that we don't waste any more time. So Facebook's approach to content regulation is really informed by our experience as one of the first companies that tried to manage harmful content on our platforms. And so I want to start by talking to you a bit about what we've been able to achieve in our platform around content enforcement. So what do we track, enforce, and report on? As digital rights experts, I assume that many of you are aware of our community standards, the rules that define what is and is not allowed on our platforms. And so we have a whole series of policy areas around what we regulate. Some of them are around adult nudity and sexual activity, violence and graphic content, hate speech, suicide, dangerous organizations. This is how we refer to terrorism, and then also fake accounts, bullying and harassment. So as you can imagine, it's difficult to define those categories independently. Some of them are very, they're not sensitive, like everybody knows what an image of exploitative sexual imagery is, especially when it comes to children. There's broad agreement that images of children need to be removed immediately. But when we talk about things like misinformation or hate speech, or even bullying and harassment, these categories are much more subjective and can be much more difficult to determine. So next, I'd like to talk about our Community Standards Enforcement Report, which unfortunately I can't show you the graph, but generally it demonstrates that we've improved significantly in our ability to action harmful content on our platforms. So over a period of 5 years in different harm categories, we've significantly improved our ability to use artificial intelligence to proactively identify harmful content and remove it before it's even seen by a user. So why is this important? This is important because generally it means that we're already working on a lot of the areas that governments and civil society find important and that motivate this need to regulate online content. I also like to be very upfront and admit that we need to do better, that there are many areas, like I mentioned, bullying and harassment, where our precision rate, our ability to proactively identify harmful content is not perfect because it's such a subjective area and it's so difficult to get it right. I also want to be very upfront about the trade-offs, and I think that's essential to the panel that we're having today, which is that the decision around content regulation is really a balancing act between safety and security of users, social cohesion in society, and also freedom of expression, as Jason was so aptly talking about a few minutes ago. And so when Facebook defines the rules that moderate what is allowed on our platforms and our enforcement against those rules, we're constantly weighing those different elements. And so in this white paper on content regulation, we established that we have 3 core principles that we think should be at the center of online content regulation. A lot of them will parallel with what Jason just explained, because Facebook is actually a member of the Global Network Initiative, so we share a lot of common principles and values. So these 3 principles are consultation, that content regulation always needs to be done in partnership with users themselves, that unilateral decisions around content regulation often miss the mark and can sometimes have adverse effects that could have been prevented if the correct stakeholders were involved in the consultative process. Within Facebook, we do our best. We can always improve, but we do our best to consult experts regionally and internationally to inform the type of policies that we put in place and to inform any changes to those policies, to adapt to different developments in the world that make our policies more or less fit for purpose. The second big principle is transparency, and that has to do with making information about how we regulate content available to the public. So we publish our community standards, we publish this community standards enforcement report. We also share who we've consulted with on different policies at different points. And all of this contributes to making participation in the way we define these rules a big part of the process, and therefore makes these rules more accountable. And then finally, it's oversight, right? So when Mark in 2019 wrote about the need for rules for the internet, he also in 2019 spoke about the need for Facebook needed other experts, that we couldn't make some of these tough calls on our own because content regulation requires deep contextual knowledge of the different issues at play, and that we wanted to be able to rely on global expertise. And to this end, as many of you may know, we've developed an external oversight board, which is an independent body. It's not part of Facebook. It's completely independent, and that body really serves this oversight function, because when decisions are so critical and so sensitive that we cannot make them on our own, we will be able to send them to this body who will be able to adjudicate independently from us and provide really important guidance on how to make those tough calls. And so finally, there's 5 really central lessons or big points to take away from our white paper. The first is about incentives. Now, Jason spoke about this as well. So ensuring accountability in companies' content moderation systems and procedures is the best way to create incentives for companies to be responsible and balance values like safety, privacy, and freedom of expression. Jason intimated to the fact that sometimes content regulation can create perverse incentives where the speed of takedown required can in fact push companies to create rules that are too broad or that will have too many false positives because they need to be easily enforced against. The second big lesson or the second big takeaway point is about the global scale of what we're talking about. Any national regulatory approach to addressing harmful content needs to respect the global scale of the internet and the value of cross-border communications. As we know, jurisdictions differ from one country to the next, but when we're talking about the internet, we need to come up with rules that can apply across. The third big area of focus around freedom of expression. So in addition to complying with Article 19 of the ICCPR, regulators need to consider the impact of their decisions on freedom of expression. Once again, this goes along with what Jason said in the introduction, which is that inadvertently, content regulation can have the impact of censoring free speech. And so when we're developing these regulations, especially within national contexts, this is why consultation is so important, so that we can understand the unintended impacts of these types of regulations. The fourth big takeaway is around the nature of technology. Technology is dynamic, it's constantly changing, and that also it has limitations in its capabilities. Some things are so complex that artificial intelligence is not perfectly suited to address them. And in those cases, we need to be even more careful in the way we define rules around content moderation. And also an approach that worked for one platform on content doesn't mean that it will work for all. There are different types of social media companies out there. Facebook is only one example. And so the type of regulations that we're putting in place need to be able to work across. And then of course, we're going to reiterate the principles of proportionality and necessity, that when we're thinking of content regulation, it's really important to think about the severity and prevalence of the harmful content. So like I was saying before, some things are very straightforward. When we're talking about children, when we're talking about terrorism, we can all agree right off the bat that this type of content needs to be actioned quickly and that we can accept a certain amount of trade-off in terms of false positives to protect people from imminent violent act or for children from exploitation. But on many other areas, such as bullying and harassment and hate speech, where the definition of these categories is much more subjective, it really requires consideration of the context. Will these types of content contribute to real world harm? How quickly? To what severity? And that can help define the type of regulation that we want to put in place, the type of rules that would be most fit for purpose in a certain context. So I want to limit my remarks to that because I think the real interest of this panel is understanding what's going on in the region, because there's a lot of efforts around content regulation. I'm happy to answer questions about Facebook's approach to these issues afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jean. So that's really great. I really appreciate that presentation. Sorry we couldn't get the slides to work for you, but just want to underscore a couple of those points that you mentioned, and then we'll go to the panel. One was the point about cross-border impacts of free expression regulation, and I think that's a really important point. We talk about that some in the policy brief that we'll be publishing, and I just want to highlight that there are already a couple of countries who, either through the regulations that they've been proposing, new laws or amendments to existing laws, or through court decisions that have been interpreting existing laws, have asserted essentially the authority to require platforms and services to not only remove content within the jurisdiction that they govern, but to make sure that content is not available anywhere on the internet in order to prevent any efforts to circumvent those blocking measures. And that, of course, creates real significant free expression conflicts to the extent that different countries have different laws and different approaches to free expression. But it also creates lots of tension between different governments, as one government can be seen as attempting to effectively impact speech and expression in another country. And in an era where we have seen lots of and increasing amounts of allegations of foreign interference, I think it's really imperative that governments take the importance of ensuring sort of geographical proportionality into serious consideration as they're developing and implementing laws that regulate content. And then the other point that I just wanted to underscore was the one you made about how the role of technology in governing technology, right? So artificial intelligence, machine learning has made many, many advances and is obviously a critical part of the solution to addressing illegal content online. And especially with a company as large as Facebook, there's just no way that even a huge number of human moderators could wrap their hands around all of the content that needs to be addressed. But it is really important that we all appreciate and understand, in particular, that regulators and lawmakers understand that, as you said, the context matters a lot. And so where machine learning filters can work very well for certain things like spam, or for finding content that has already been determined to be illegal. So people who are attempting to repost content that has already been taken down. It's much less effective in other contexts. For example, identifying speech that might constitute hate speech, or identifying and adjudicating a particular content that tends to that has sort of changed over time, right? So where it may contain an element of speech that seems familiar or looks like something else that's already been adjudicated. If the context around it has changed, that can really change the meaning. And so those are just really important points. I wanted to just quickly underscore them. Let's turn next to Mutoki Mumo, who is with the Committee to Protect Journalists. Mutoki is currently CPJ Sub-Saharan Africa representative. She's been with CPJ since 2017 and focused a lot on content regulation in the context of media and media freedom. Mutoki, I want to give you a chance to talk about some of the initiatives under law and the efforts that you've seen in Sub-Saharan Africa to regulate content. So please take it away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Just checking that you can hear me properly. If you can, give me a thumbs up, Jason, if you can hear me clearly. Good. So as Jason said, my name is Mutoki Mumo. I work with the Committee to Protect Journalists. I am based in Nairobi, Kenya. The Committee to Protect Journalists is an independent non-governmental organization that champions the rights and the freedoms of journalists across the world. I'll take my 5 minutes, and I'm going to try to time myself to talk very briefly and in sort of a cursory way about how the issues that Jeanne and Jason have talked about how content is being regulated or is trying to be regulated, specifically in Kenya and Tanzania. I'll be speaking about Kenya's 2018 Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act, and I'll be talking about Tanzania's online content regulations, the original iteration of them in 2018, but the revised version also in 2020 that is more problematic. So to begin with, Kenya, my home country. In 2018, Kenya passed its Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Act. This came in the context of a recent election in 2017, when some surveys indicated as many as 9 out of 10 people had been exposed to misinformation or disinformation of some form. So when this law was being debated on the floor of Parliament, false news, or as the parliamentarian said, fake news, became something that was very big, very prominent. And actually, according to my analysis of the Hansard, the parliamentary record on the day that this law was passed, is also the day that the government or parliamentarians, the majority leader in parliament, introduced 2 clauses to the law that have really been deeply problematic for freedom of expression and of the press in Kenya. These are Article 22 and 23 of this law, which speaks specifically on false news and false information, impose criminal sanctions for the publication of information that is deemed to be false. So we noted as CPJ, and many other people also noted, local actors and international actors, some problems with this from the very beginning. So first of all, the law doesn't take too much time to specifically define some of the things that it's prohibiting, or some of the things for which people can be criminally sanctioned. So for instance, false news is prohibited, but what exactly is false news? Unclear. And another bone of contention for us was that this law seemed to be attempting to introduce issues that have already been declared unconstitutional by the Kenyan court. So the issue of criminal defamation. When this law was being debated in Parliament and when the issue of false news came up, one of the ways that parliamentarians tried to argue for this was to talk about the reputation of specific prominent individuals. So from that, it was already a red flag, the nature that this law was going to be used to protect reputations of people rather than public interest. And since what we've seen since the law has started being implemented, lends credence to those original concerns. So what has been the impact? This law, the Kenyan civil society is very robust, and from the beginning, they challenged this law in court in 2018, and whole sections of it were suspended pending court hearings. However, as of this year, as of February, unless I'm mistaken, the law was allowed to come into effect, and immediately we saw that police did not hesitate to use this new weapon that they had in their hands. Since particularly during this time of pandemic, we've seen several bloggers and social media users being arrested and accused of publishing false information in contravention to the Computer Misuse and Cybercrimes Act of 2018. The situation was such that one columnist in a local newspaper had to make a point and tell people, hey, we've never been in a position to regulate lies in the real life. So why, or perceived lies, why are we trying to do this online? And pointing out the detrimental effects on this on public discourse at a time of pandemic. So I'm just going to pause there on Kenya and move very quickly to Tanzania, and I'll take any questions that you may have. So the specific law that I had to discuss on Tanzania, as I said, are the online content regulations. These regulations are part of a broader mother law called EPOCA, the Electronic and Postal Communications Act. I think I got it right. And they were originally passed in 2018. Already lots and lots of red flags. They imposed licensing for bloggers and people using YouTube's, imposed incredibly high financial and bureaucratic barriers to the entry into the online space. Since immediately after they came into force, we already saw some impact with some bloggers saying that they were deregistering, going offline, essentially because it was either too expensive to comply with this law, or because they didn't want to do it on principle. In 2020, 2 months ago, July, Tanzania amended these regulations. The argument from the government was that we're trying to make them more specific and clear, but what really happened is that they were more specifically prohibitive. So what we've seen is that the barriers for entry have been further increased. So for instance, in Tanzania right now, if you're a broadcaster who has a regional license, meaning that you have a license to broadcast traditionally in a specific province or district, you cannot go online and live stream. That's against the law right now. They've also broadly expanded what is prohibited in Tanzania using very vague terms. And if you look at the lists of what is prohibited, basically it's like everything. So if you are a journalist, it's incredibly difficult to report critically and independently and also comply with this law. I know I'm out of time, but just to demonstrate how deeply insidious this is, some examples include that you can't publish information that causes confusion about the economy. What is confusion about the economy? That means business reporting, out the door. You can't publish information that promotes adultery. And then they reintroduce slander and defamation. You can't expose the private info of individuals. Truth is not a defense here, and neither is it a defense to talk about public interest. So what happens to journalists who want to report on public officials and their maybe private going-ons that have a public impact? You can't harm the reputation and prestige of Tanzania, cause annoyance or threaten harm to individuals, and you can't report about weather forecast. suspected droughts or disease outbreaks without getting permission from relevant authorities. And there's also a prohibition for bad language. What in the world is bad language? So all of this is sending sort of a chilling message. If you try to comply with this law, you can see in a very real effect some of the things that Jason brought up. You will be paralyzed, because how do you interpret this in your day-to-day work as a journalist? The law requires immediate takedowns when notified by authorities. There's very little in the way of remedies for those who've been affected for this. And there are deeply punitive measures of up to a year in prison, little or no carve-outs for public interest and for journalism, as I pointed out. The fact that this is coming into effect literally within weeks of an election is telling for a lot of us. And I think that in a way is where I will conclude by pointing out how political times really are creating room for some of these laws to come into place. If you look at the laws that I talked about, Kenya, in the wake of an election where misinformation was an issue, Parliament gives itself power, and Parliament enacts a law that gives the government very broad powers. In Tanzania, in the eve of an election, a minister who's, it's legal, but it's problematic that a minister enacts unilaterally these regulations that just affect the freedom of expression online and ultimately will erode what people can and say and do online and the diversity of opinions. I think I'm like 3 minutes over, so I'm going to shut up.
Thank you, Muthoki. They're very, very interesting and very relevant examples from East Africa, and deeply insidious is indeed, I think, a good way of describing that Tanzanian law, especially in the context of the upcoming election. So thanks for that example. I want to turn next to Charlie Martel Ngonu, who is the founder of Afro Leadership, which is a civil society organization promoting human rights, digital rights, and data rights in Africa, with a focus on Francophone Africa. Charlie, tell us a little bit about what you are seeing happening in Central Africa and Francophone Africa.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you for having me here. And I hope I make myself heard. And okay, thank you. I support what Muthoki was just saying, and I think we face same situation. It's like we are just in the same country, when you look at what is happening in most of our countries, and from what you've seen, you've just seen is that most of our countries were surprised by the amount of, or maybe the climax of what they call fake news and the way it disrupted the kind of governance that we live in. And that's truly the problem that we face in so many of our countries. And so governments are really, really disarmed. They don't know how to manage this complex new situation they are in, and especially because the technologies that are being used, for this content generation is just out of their control. And then they don't actually know how to behave. And that's what I say in so many of these countries, when you will go through all the legislation that you find here and there, you will see that things are not that clear. It seems like legislation, the legislation process is being done in a kind of rush. There is no time to prepare things. There is no time to involve citizens, and they are not used to involving citizens in the legislative process. So it's just normal in that side that they won't have anyone, giving his own insight. And the most, the saddest in this issue is that, those same people that are governing our countries are the one that, to use all the opportunities of electronic governance, but they are legislating around things that relates to technology and electronic and digital matters. So that's why you will see so much, kind of, or maybe so many discrepancies between what is going on in the international setting and what we have locally. I've seen in Chad that last year they resorted to just shut down internet, or maybe just censor social medias, because they didn't know how to manage the issue of what they call disinformation. That is just the attitude of citizens that have been prevented to give their opinion regularly, and today they have just it's just like a dam has just been opened, and so they have to bear with it. And my view will be that if they knew actually that the kind of the type of governance that they use day by day will certainly open doors to some kind of negative impacts, they will prepare well, but they are not open to this kind of discussion, and so they are preparing themselves to what we see. And I agree with John when John said minutes ago that the issue is building trust with users. If we don't build trust, we can. My view is that I don't see how best they will even apply legislation that have been published. It's almost impossible given the massive wake of what you see online as fake news, as disinformation and misinformation. If we don't build a new space for trust between users that generate content and government, it would be very difficult to curb this. You already have that addresses the role of platforms and intermediaries. It addresses child pornography in a light way. Indeed, but from what I know, last July, they issued a communique telling us that they will reinforce all those roles from the intermediary. They will enforce. They will build a charter for child pornography, cyber security modules in school curricula. They will do so many of those things, but that's not for me. That's not the issue. In Chad, in Gabon, in Central African Republic, where you have a national strategy to prevent fake news and misinformation, they don't have a specific law on this, but they have a national strategy paper, against fake news, to curb fake news and disinformation. I don't see the response being in legislation. Given the situation we are in, and the problem we have mostly in Central Africa is the issue of trust. In my country, you will see clearly, in Gabon, this is true in Chad, this is true everywhere, is that you have people, you have president or political system that has been there for too long. And so people take, this technology, this space as, space where they can really express their concern without, behind the anonymity of their keyboard. So we need, my view, if I want to wrap up, is to make sure that, I can get heard in this conclusion that we need to build a space of trust, because if users trust the system, the political system or the democratic system, if they trust government as working for them, I think we will have an impact, a positive impact in the kind of content that is generated by users. That's what I can say before the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. Very, very useful remarks. And I think it's really important to see network disruptions as a form of content regulation, as part of the spectrum of responses that governments are using. As you point out, it's a deeply problematic response, but the reality is we need to recognize that sometimes governments are using those kinds of drastic measures to respond because they don't know what other tools they have in their toolkit. And so part of the solution is for all of us constructively to demonstrate the right ways to handle these kinds of content related concerns, so as not to allow governments to use the excuse of drastic measures, whether that's a network disruption or a very deeply problematic law. And so I think that's super helpful. I want to turn next to Molly Land, who is the Catherine Rohrabacher Professor of Law and Human Rights at the University of Connecticut School of Law and Associate Director there of the University of Connecticut's Human Rights Institute. Molly is a longtime academic member of GNI. Her research focuses on the intersection of human rights, science, and technology, and she has a new book out called The New Technologies for Human Rights Law and Practice, which provides a roadmap for understanding the relationship between technology, human rights law, and practice. And so, Molly, I know you've been doing some work looking at, in particular, Nigeria of late, and would love to hear some of your thoughts on content regulation generally, as well as what you've been seeing in Nigeria. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I've loved hearing everything that's been said so far. I wanted to provide a brief overview of some recent legislation that's been introduced in Nigeria with reference and comparison to other laws around the world. I just wanted to start by saying I'm not Nigerian, and we are launching a research project that would include Nigeria, but my plans to travel there to meet with activists and begin building collaborations were frustrated by the pandemic. So I've been trying to launch the project from afar, but I have worked on GNI's content regulation policy positions, and I've been tracking and following these two pieces of legislation in Nigeria very closely, given their impacts on freedom of expression. That said, there are likely others on the call, attendees and panelists alike, who have deeper local knowledge of the legal environment and political environment in Nigeria. So I look forward to hearing all of your thoughts on these pieces of legislation. There were two bills that I've been tracking that were introduced in the fall of 2019. One called the Protection from Internet Falsehood and Manipulation Bill, also known as the Social Media Bill. So this is a law that's aimed at suppressing falsehoods and manipulation and encouraging transparency, modeled on legislation that was passed last year in Singapore. The second piece of legislation is a bill called the National Commission for the Prohibition of Hate Speech Bill, also called, the shorthand is the Hate Speech Bill. This prohibits ethnic discrimination, hate speech, harassment on the basis of ethnicity, ethnic or racial contempt, and discrimination. It would also, I think, very interestingly, create a commission designed to oversee regulation of, oversee hate speech, I think very broadly, although its powers are pretty undefined. It would be tasked with things like training and education, but also given some quasi-judicial and adjudicatory power to investigate complaints. But again, the mandate of the commission is left unclear. The laws, I just wanted to update folks on the status. And again, there may be even more recent updates that I haven't been able to track from afar, but it met with considerable resistance. There's a history in Nigeria of the government using existing law, both broadcast regulation law and the Nigerian Cybercrime Act, to target bloggers, journalists, and activists. And there's a lot of fear within civil society organizations and digital rights activists that these new bills would also be used to target and silence critics. The bills were not successful in getting through the last National Assembly. There were protests, and both bills were roundly critiqued in a March 2020 town hall. And over the summer, there were also marches against the bills. There's also been a lawsuit brought against the hate speech bill, as far as I can tell, based on national constitutional principles. there is some thought that the government might try to get them through the next, the current, session of the government. But just before the September recess, a spokesperson for the Senate said it wasn't planning to revisit at least the social media bill. So in sum, I think the legislation is currently on ice in a sense, right? It's being held in abeyance, but it has not been abandoned. And I think that, as I'll say at the very end of my comments, I think that it's likely that the government will try to revisit these laws at some point in the near future. The two problems I wanted to call attention to, and these are very resonant of things that my co-panelists have already talked about in other places. As Charlie said, there are very similar elements in all of these regulatory efforts. And I would say not only within Africa, but also broadly globally, right? Governments, as we discuss in the policy brief, are defining regulations or failing to define regulations with sufficient precision, and the penalties are overbroad. And those are the two main problems that I would also identify in both of these Nigerian bills. The first is the lack of definition, and Musoki also mentioned this with respect to the laws in Kenya and Tanzania. But in the social media bill in particular, it would prohibit not only false statements, which itself is very problematic, but also, among other things, statements that might prejudice national security, statements that might influence the outcome of an election. And I'll just make a note, what political speech is there that doesn't seek to influence the outcome of an election? Or speech that might incite feelings of enmity or hatred toward a person or group of persons, or which might diminish public confidence in the government. So these are very, very broad categories, certainly much broader than anything that human rights law would require be prohibited under the guise of incitement. In the hate speech bill, that bill defines discrimination as treating another Nigerian less favorably than one treats someone from his or her own ethnic group, prohibiting words that would stir up ethnic hatred. And all of these, again, are just very, very broad categories that can, it's feared would be used to instrumentalize a persecution of dissent and critique. The other main problem I wanted to call attention to in my remaining 25 seconds is proportionality. There are many very significant sanctions associated with each of these bills. Under the social media bill, violators can be punished with prison terms of up to 3 years or 300,000 naira in terms of financial penalties. The hate speech bill has been particularly critiqued for its penalties. It includes up to 5 years in prison, 10 million naira, and a provision that if the hate speech results in the death of an individual, that it could lead to imposition of the death penalty. Finally, I'd note that these laws are also significant in terms of the power that they would give the government over internet service providers and platforms. The social media bill explicitly envisions, and so Charlie, I think this resonates with your comments about internet shutdowns. It envisions that law enforcement can order internet service providers to disable internet access, and they can also issue what the law calls stop transmission orders. And these access blocking orders would allow law enforcement to require platforms to disable access without giving any guidance to the law enforcement or constraint on the law enforcement about when that's appropriate and how to ensure that it is proportional. In other work that GNI has done, it has documented problems with internet shutdowns as being overbroad and unlikely to unduly impact freedom of expression. And so I guess just in sum, I say, I would suspect that some version of these bills, even though the government has not made any indication concrete indication that it would continue to pursue them. I imagine some version will be introduced. Versions of these laws have been introduced in the past, both in 2015 and I think in 2018. The government also at the same time is working on increasing the penalties associated with existing laws. It just in early August increased the penalties that apply to broadcasters for broadcasting hate speech to up to now 5 million naira, which is about 13,000 US dollars. So this is clearly an issue that the Nigerian government is still interested in, in pushing forward in some version. It may be that they'll take out some of the most egregious provisions, such as the death penalty, but I don't think that this issue is over at all. So with that, I'll leave that there. And again, I really look forward to conversation.
Thanks so much, Molly. Yeah, it's good it has been refreshing to see the sort of civil society response to these laws in Nigeria. I think that's also something we've seen in other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. People are aware of and engaged on these issues, which is a really important check on the kinds of disproportionate laws and approaches that we've been talking about. Certainly we need more of that, more engagement and more awareness. Hopefully this session will help with that to some extent. And I know a lot of the people on this call are engaged in that kind of awareness raising and organizing. So thank you to everyone who's been involved in those efforts. And speaking of groups that are involved in those kinds of efforts, I want to turn to our last panelist, Berhan Tai, who's with Access Now, which has been doing a great job working to raise awareness and organize around internet shutdowns and other human rights related issues in the technology sector. Berhan is a researcher who investigates the relationship between technology, society, and social justice. And she is the Africa Policy Manager and Global Internet Shutdowns Lead at Access Now. Berhan, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks, Jason. Good morning and good afternoon. My name is Berhan. I'm hoping you guys can hear me. Yeah, I think you can. Yeah, so I think majority of my fellow panelists have covered some of the patterns that we've seen across East Africa and in other places. So I want my conversation to focus on specifically on one, because we want to talk about context and what this actually means for real individuals that are out there living their lives on Facebook, YouTube, and others. So I would want to dive in a bit on some of the context in Ethiopia and what we're seeing, and what content governance actually means when violence escalates on the ground. So Ethiopia brought in a hate speech and fake news legislation, as many countries, extremely problematic, the same issues that we highlighted here in terms of being broadly defined, the due process, the lack of due process, the lack of judicial oversight on what is actually legitimate speech and what's not, social media platforms being the arbitrators of truth. A lot of the problems that we see across many different similar legislations are also present in the Ethiopian one. But one thing I think that's really critical here to highlight, and I think some of the stuff that Charlie has been highlighting, is the fact that fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech is an actual threat to both democratic and non-democratic governments across the world. So very recently, so after this legislation came in, of course, the first few individuals to be charged with it were journalists that were specifically sharing information about COVID-related responses from the government. And again, this is not unique to Ethiopia. This is what we're seeing, in other parts of the world as well, and all the way to Myanmar and other places. So now when we come to content governance and what this legislation means for content governance and the lack of content governance actually is specifically, in June and July, there was, massive violence in the country. More than 200 people have died. We still don't know the exact number of people that have died. The violence did not necessarily start on Facebook or on YouTube, but Facebook and YouTube and other social media platforms were really critical in the being a breeding ground for hate, misinformation, disinformation, and for calling for violence. So we know, as the violence escalated on the ground, content shared online and text, live stream, and any format that you can imagine was calling for the destruction of property of minorities, was basically a melting pot of a lot of the human rights violations that we're all freaked out about as we were watching the videos come in. So while the majority of the content that was posted during that really tense time was taken down, there's still significant content that has not been taken down. So this is why when a Silicon Valley based organization or tech company is coming up with a universal rule for how content is governed, this is also some of the problems that we're seeing in Ethiopia, for instance. So Facebook has a trusted partner programs across the world. Specifically, this one in Ethiopia did not work because when the internet was shut down, the content that was being shared online didn't stop. What stopped was, the trusted partners that are working for free for Facebook to report this content went offline because majority of them are based in Addis or in Ethiopia. So while the diaspora is also a different context, and that might not necessarily be the same in the US or in the UK or in France, but the diaspora is really strong in other parts of the world, right? Like, so the diaspora was still able to propagate hate and a lot of misinformation, disinformation. So the lack of content governance, it's not just about how governments are trying to restrict, and how they're trying to regulate content. It's also about the real lack of content governance, content moderation on Facebook and YouTube. So what we saw there was that, still until today, because the internet was shut down and because of a lot of the misinformation, disinformation that was present on these social media platforms, we don't know the extent of the violence that has happened. And there's very different narrative of exactly what happened online. So that is one implication that we're seeing. And then now, when we come back to this, the infamous, the oversight board, for instance, this is again what we mean with, Facebook's user base. 80% of them are not based out of Europe or are not based out of North America. But majority of the content governance over the oversight board is actually, white Americans and Europeans. So if majority of them are Africans and Asians, why is the norm and the narrative that we're still trying to set, being determined by individuals that don't necessarily have our, or understand our lived reality? And that is a really critical question. Then now we move on to, this conversations of, and this comes from the real experience of, frustration with working with Facebook and YouTube again, is, the lack of context. They don't context changes every time. I think if we were having the same conversation in 2015 in the US and now, the context has completely changed. And in other parts of the world, that's how it also changed. So the lack of context is really, in terms of the content governance work that they're doing currently is really visible, especially in the Ethiopian context. For instance, there are about 7 or 8 million Ethiopian users. That's, that's something Facebook users reported by Facebook, but, content reporting is not available in majority of the language that people use, and specifically on mobile apps, it's non-existent. We're waiting for the standards to be translated to a specific language. This is again, when we talk about context, that's what we mean. It's not about, Facebook saying they've taken down 3 billion content from the world. We want it to be contextualized. How many have you taken down? And of course, that taking down content has to follow the proportionality, the legality, all of those things that we're talking about. But how many have you taken down? Transparency and accountability in terms of how much content is taken down is not there. And then when we move to YouTube, it's also the same issue where people are intuitive, they understand how these things work, right? Like, so videos are being reposted and reposted. It's just so exhausting to report the same content over and over again to be taken down. Some are in music forums that are calling for the genocide of certain population. And again, now I just briefly, I want to touch on this issue of, technology moderating content, right? So it's really quite actually a big luxury to talk about the AI being able to take down content that's, that we all know to be toxic, that we all know to be problematic. In our context, we're still waiting for the machine learning to learn our language. And that's because, some people sitting out of Silicon Valley said it's fine. When you write in Amharic, when you write in Oromifa, when you write in Tigrinya, when you write in Zulu or Hausa, it doesn't take it down. So that's, they're a multi-billion-dollar organization. So that's not, so that shouldn't be our problem to deal with, right? Like, so they're still making money out of this. So there should be some understanding. Again, this is what we mean with context. It's not just about how much you take down or who you appoint or what work Mark Zuckerberg does. Is that in the everyday lives of individuals, Facebook has a really pervasive impact, and nobody's willing to talk about that. So the last point that I want to raise before I hand over to Jason is this issue of, so if the machine learning is yet to learn our language, and God knows when that's going to be, who are the individuals that are actually moderating content? So whenever we speak with Facebook, for instance, they tell us, there's double-digit content moderators for Ethiopia. Double-digit can be 11 between 99. So there's a big gap between those two numbers, right? So transparency in terms of who's moderating that content. We're not necessarily interested about who the individuals are, but individual biases really matter, right? Like, so again, if we're talking about context, if you're, from an Oromo that comes from Wallagga, or from an Oromo that comes from Arisi or whatever, my appetite for what content I feel is acceptable is very different, and I understand my bias as a person that works in the space. So a lot of that is not really addressed. While all in the meantime, what we're seeing currently is that there's a massive problem with disinformation and misinformation, really organized to an extent that's quite alarming as we go through an election, and that's coming up in May. The lack of content moderation, the lack of transparency around how content is being moderated, the lack of translation of content reporting services in relevant language is all what we're seeing. So when we mean context, it's it has to be, and we've seen this is not just an issue that happens in Ethiopia. We're seeing similar trends in India. We've seen devastating impacts that Facebook has and other social media platforms have in Myanmar, and we're trying to prepare and avoid another Myanmar incident. So I'll end with that. Jason, back to you.
Thanks very much, Berhan. Yeah, certainly the situation in Ethiopia is very challenging at the moment, and with the election coming up, I think only likely to get more so. And so very much appreciate you calling attention to what's been happening there and online. Just a couple of really interesting points that I want to underscore that you made. I think the first one is the reliance on sort of trusted notifiers and other groups to help, to deal with either hate speech or other forms of problematic content is I think important, and we see it having some benefits in different places. But as you point out, when the internet is shut down, that resource is no longer available, and then you can create a real problem to the extent that you are relying significantly on those kinds of groups to be helping to identify problematic content, especially in a situation like Ethiopia, where we have so much content coming from outside the country. So that's a really important dynamic to understand. I don't think Ethiopia is alone in having that dynamic, certainly in the continent. And then separately, your point about transparency and sort of understanding better how platforms are dealing with these issues, I think is critical, and that echoes a question that was in the chat. So I'll just read that and put it over to Jean to respond to. The question was about Facebook, whether Facebook publishes information about its procedures, how much content is moderated by humans versus algorithms, and how many human moderators work in Africa, and what languages are covered. So Jean, if you want to respond to that and any other points, then there's a couple more questions I'll put to the group broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. And thank you, Berhan, for your honesty in challenging Facebook to do better and to improve the way that we're able to moderate content to keep our community of users safe in Ethiopia. I want to start off by recognizing that we have fallen short and that we are in the process of trying to do better in Ethiopia. We are deeply concerned by the situation in Ethiopia, and we have mobilized many teams internally to try to address many of the challenges that you've raised. I don't think that it's an appropriate platform to go through each of them in detail, but what I can say is that it's true. I think that just like Charlie said, just like Molly and Mutoki were saying, in many ways, the challenges of content moderation outpace even the ability of companies like Facebook. I think it's not to excuse a lack of effort, but I think that in many ways, during the internet shutdown, we were all taken by surprise a bit. We could have anticipated the role of the diaspora, but we couldn't have anticipated it to this extent. And so it's a lesson learned. It's a lesson learned for Facebook and for anybody who works on digital rights in the region to recognize that, like, focusing on actors in a country to understand context is not sufficient, and that we need to think about the whole realm of stakeholders that are contributing to content on the platform. In terms of like transparency and sharing the number of reviewers, AI proactive takedowns versus human review. I actually don't have those figures. As Berhan rightly noted, we do have concerns about the security of our reviewers. I think in the past, we were more open about information about who our reviewers were, the type of languages that were covered, but unfortunately, sometimes that led to security issues. But once again, none of this is to necessarily come to the defense of Facebook. I think the points raised are salient and it's areas where we're trying to do better. I think it's really important to underline too that Facebook has changed a lot in recent years and that we're making increasing strides to address the concerns raised. Perhaps we're not doing it fast enough, but we are always seeking to improve. And I think our engagement in these types of forums to open ourselves up to these types of honest conversations about where we can do better is a step in the right direction. So Berhan and I speak pretty often, so I hope that we can continue to speak and work on these issues together. Thanks.
Thanks, Jean. Yeah, I want to thank Berhan for raising these really important and serious points, but also underscore my appreciation to Jean for being part of this session on Facebook broadly, for at least kind of showing up and being part of these conversations, acknowledging some of the challenges they face and the fact that they can't solve them alone. There's another question here from the comments that I want to kind of put out to the group. But I think Molly in particular, you may have some thoughts on this. One of the participants asked that said that they're curious about learning more about regulations and laws that by design have criminalized and sanctioned offenses while omitting mens rea. So basically the intent components of law. So making it prohibitive to and potentially even criminal to say certain things online, even if you don't necessarily intend and not require the government to be able to prove that you intended the harm or to violate the law. I think in particular, this is a challenge when it comes to things like disinformation, where oftentimes people are passing along something that they received and they may not know that the information itself was false. They may judge it in their own personal view to be true or at least worthy of discussion. But when disinformation laws are written so broadly as to basically prohibit anybody spreading any kind of information that the government at the end of the day decides is not true, then people can end up being sanctioned in some cases quite heavily. The law that comes to mind kind of most seriously jeopardizing free expression in this regard is the POFMA law in Singapore, which we talk about in the brief, which is the fake news law there. But I know there are other efforts in other countries to come up with similar approaches. I wrote an article recently about this and I'll post it here in the chat. But let me see if other panelists have anything that they want to say about this point about sort of criminal intent and how difficult it can be to determine intent with regard to people speaking online. Go ahead, Molly. I don't know if you were raising your hand or.
Yeah, I'm happy to defer to others, but what I would love to throw in, and in some ways I think this might bridge some of the laws that we were talking about in the first half of the discussion and some of the dynamics that Berhan was talking about that are happening in Ethiopia. I think, yes, so adding an intent requirement would make it more proportional so that people wouldn't be able to be prosecuted for simply disseminating speech without any intent. But I think trying to determine individual intent with respect to any particular item of content is both infeasible and also potentially disproportionate when you're talking about both the government and social media companies. I don't know that governments and social media companies should be in the business of looking at each individual piece of content and determining whether it's true or not and what a person intended. It's just too much. And what I would suggest, and this is based on some research that we're doing, the multi-country study looks at Guatemala, Colombia, Serbia, and now hopefully in the future Nigeria, if we're able. I don't think so disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, they are all serious and real problems as we see in Ethiopia. But the problem is not individual ordinary citizens, right, who are putting up information, even if that information may be false. I think that the significant sources of disinformation, misinformation that are really problematic are coming from coordinated sources. They're coming from states, they're coming from state-aligned actors, they're coming from politicians who hire propaganda firms, network centers. called net centers in Latin America, troll farms, to put up particular messages that are deliberately inciting and incendiary to try to consolidate power and disable and undermine their opposition and their critics. So I would love to see both legislation and social media responses switch from looking at content as an individual content problem and switch it more to a systemic analysis of who are the really bad actors, who are creating these conditions where genocide can flourish. And so I think in this respect, Nigeria's law is exactly the wrong direction because it's looking at individual pieces of content and individual actors. And again, I think that's not really where the problem is at.
Yeah, that's a great point, Molly. And there's been some really good work, I think, of late done by academics and researchers and even cybersecurity analysts who have started to really identify some of the trends in disinformation and misinformation and be able to really point to the fact that the vast majority of it comes from a small number of very well organized and resourced sources. And so going after those sources rather than sort of scattershot, whoever the last person to tweet something or the last person to post something is really the better way to get to the root of the problem. Anyone else want to talk to that issue, either of disinformation or this issue of intent?
Charlie here. And thank you, Jason. What Molly just said was my next point on this. And I will just illustrate what she just said. A few days ago, a main political party in Cameroon organized what we call here march, that they will go out to express their concern about the way the country is being led. And, and there was a kind of campaign from the government turning this march into kind of insurgency. And that's what was learned by everybody on social medias, on the official TV, official radio, being broadcasted even with political discourse, political speeches. They were out there telling people that organizing this is kind of going out for, as insurgent. And I think, how can we talk of this? Is this not disinformation? Actually, something that is being led, to change people's mind for, to keep power and just to undermine anything that can open the floor, that can, open the democratic space, for people to discuss and change their destiny. And I think, and this can be more subtle in so many of our space. And we actually know that our states have their kind of team, working in this to change our mind and our mindset. And that's the problem. And for me, that's the real issue. And this explains why they can allow for kind of participatory legislative process. It's impossible, because if they use all this as weapons to protect their power, to keep the grip on the power, it's impossible to believe that even their process, their solution, they are trying to look for solution is fair. And once nothing is fair, you have the results. People don't trust legislation, people don't trust regulation, and then we are just open to upcoming crisis. That's my fear, actually. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. No, great point. Thank you for expanding on that. We've been given a little bit more time given the late start, so we'll just take maybe one more question and use that to sort of give everyone a chance to make any concluding remarks. So Musa put in the Zoom chat here a question about the hate speech law in Nigeria, and asks how can the media, traditional media, I assume, discourage such targeted laws against free dissemination of information in the country. And I think that brings up a really interesting point. And I know Muthoki, you'll probably have something to say about this, but there is an important dynamic between new media and traditional media that is playing into regulation all over the world. On the one hand, a lot of traditional media has been undermined by the existence of new mediums and the sort of advertising models that both traditional and new media rely on, have spread advertising dollars out in a way that has challenged the business model of traditional media. And in some countries, and I'll just point to the UK, I think in particular, we've seen traditional media very much taking a kind of an aggressive approach to new media in terms of how they cover issues online, and sort of pushing the government in some ways for regulation of new media. I think, you know, there's a lot of legitimate conversation to be had about business models and the importance of traditional media and the need to safeguard it, while also protecting new media, which can be, you know, more bottom up and democratic in some ways. But I think there's also a short-sightedness to traditional media calling for government regulation of new media because, as we've seen in some of the contexts we've discussed already, that can result in, you know, real significant challenges to free expression broadly, not just on new media, but also on traditional media. And governments who are willing to censor free expression in new media are probably going to do the same thing in traditional media. So I guess the broad question, picking up on Musa's point to the group, is, you know, how do we forge a better alliance between media broadly defined and the public to push back against overly broad regulation that will result in censorship? Let me turn to you first, Mukoki, since this is your area of expertise, and then ask others to chime in, and then we'll kind of use this as our concluding round of comments.
I mean, I wish I had all the best, all the great answers on this, but it's an issue that we increasingly confront in the work that we do, because especially if you look at the Eastern Horn of Africa region, a lot of the problematic legislation that is actively trying to erode FOE is targeting online media, or where there are broad laws, we see them sort of being imposed fast on people who you might argue are maybe on the fringes, people who might not have the broad reach of a national newspaper, or might not have that kind of muscle. And one of the things that I personally have been pushing and shouting about is looking at this issue holistically, in the sense of, and this is such a cliche, but an attack on a YouTuber or someone using social media is an attack on a traditional newspaper that sells on the street, because once the weapon proves active, you cannot trust that governments will put it away and say, okay, now we've dealt with all the people who played along, the mainstream media or the traditional media, you know, it's all fine. No, that's not how it's going to work. This is a testing ground. And I really wish and hope that we could see more cross-platform solidarity I had coming into this. That when a blogger in Kenya is arrested, we ought to be seeing even coverage of that story in the mainstream media. The fact that you have a newspaper that people buy every day and a television that people watch every day is incredibly powerful. Champion your own rights on those platforms. Be there when these people are being brought to court. I have, and I hope if this individual is on this webinar, they'll forgive me for using this, but I recall a conversation I had with someone in Kenya where they were describing a situation in court where the problematic Computer Misuse and Cybercrime Act was being litigated, and they were trying to get a newspaper journalist to cover the story. And the newspaper journalist was sort of dismissive and said, oh, this is the law for the bloggers. This is not the law for the bloggers. This is the law that's going to affect every single person who's trying to express themselves critically or independently online. And that includes the mainstream media. And I wish for more solidarity there. Jason, please forgive me, but I want to make a very small point on intent, which is the thing, the previous question that we had before this. Now, I am not a lawyer, so I cannot speak to this in the same way a lawyer would, but it occurs to me as we speak about why intent is not explicitly included in some of these laws that we're looking at, we should also ask ourselves, what is the intent of the law itself? policymakers are not fools. They know what they're doing. And I think they realize, and as we've seen this in the Kenyan perspective, that the problem is not a random social media user in a village posting something. The problem is coordinated, sometimes powerful people. And we saw this in the 2017 election, using these platforms to their ends. But the intent of the law is not to undermine that, because they think that they might need this when elections come around. The intent of the law is to make sure the small, individual critical speaker is not going to come out and speak loudly against these powerful people. So when we're asking ourselves why, criminal intent is not explicitly included in these laws, we also need to ask ourselves, what's the intent of the laws? And in answering that question, we see that it was perhaps in some places never even the intent to tackle misinformation or to even, act in the public interest. It was the goal to act in the interest of the powerful. And I'm going to shut up now.
Thanks, Muthoki. That's a great point. Thank you for making that. Let's see, Berhan, any points you want to make before we conclude?
Sure, yeah. I think Muthoki has a really, that was fire and she was preaching. So definitely reiterate that. I think the other thing that I want to mention here is like how these laws put the burden on individuals, right? Like, so again, if you take the context of Ethiopia, like many other countries that we all, inhibit here, the burden is on the individual to figure out what's misinformation and what's disinformation, and sift through the truth and the false, and be a responsible citizen. That's not fair, right? Like, so the burden should not be on the individual to be able to navigate through this, even when governments can't navigate through the facts. Majority of the time, I think one of the biggest propagators of hateful content, misinformation, disinformation are actually our own government, our own elected officials, one way or the other. So the burden shouldn't be on the ordinary citizen that's walking on the streets, that's trying to figure out what is true and false. So so that burden should not be on citizens. And this idea of responsible citizens that navigate. No, what have you given those citizens to be responsible for? What digital security, what digital hygiene things have we taught our citizens? So that's some of the questions that come to me. Yeah, I'll conclude with that. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Farhan. Jean, Charlie, Molly, any last comments before we close? If not, that's fine. I think we can close it there. That was great concluding remarks, I think, from Muthoki and Farhan. Great points all really across the board. This has been, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've done a number of these consultations in a number of contexts around the world over the last few months. This, I would say, has really been one of the richest. The examples that you all have cited are, I think, really interesting, in some cases quite troubling. But we've sort of managed to point out that the dynamics themselves are really troubling. And so, we all need to take some responsibility for figuring out the right way forward. I really want to thank all of you for not just participating today, but for your ongoing work to be part of that solution. GNI hopes to be part of that as well, and we look forward to continuing to work with all of you and with the participants and attendees who joined this call to continue this conversation after FIF Africa. Thanks again to the organizers of the event. I hope people will continue.
Hi, Chris from GNI. So it seems like a very unfortunate time to have lost Jason, but I just would like to reiterate our thanks for this really valuable multi-stakeholder conversation, and just note to be on the lookout for upcoming content regulation policy brief, which will kind of lay out what we hope is a helpful framework for navigating some of these very complex content governance and regulatory challenges. Thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.